Hey Subfuries, today we'll be talking about one of my favourite topics of Elder Scrolls lore, the beautiful, volcanic, mushroom-filled wasteland that is Morrowind. We've actually already talked about Morrowind early history once before. We know that after the legendary prophet Veloth led his people to settle in the land of Resdayn, now known as Morrowind, the Golden Age of the Chimer began. But what made it so golden? It's a very Moses and the Israelites-esque kind of story, and I think that was done on purpose. This early era of Morrowind history is shrouded in mystery, but we do know one thing, that the three, quote, good Daedric princes, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura, played major roles in the culture of the Velothi, teaching them and guiding them. What remnants do we have of this ancient civilization of stoicism and assassination? And what do they tell us about what these three Daedra did back then? This is just one chapter in the story of Morrowind. Morrowind was the promised land. It was everything that the Velothi people had hoped for, if you ignore the damn cliff races. Gosh, I hate them. They are now extinct and the world is better for it. The Velothi were known as the Chimer, and that's what I'll call them. Now we do know that the Dunmer look back on this time in early Morrowind history as a period of high culture for their people. His mass pilgrimage to a new land where stoic values were established was successful. The race enjoyed a period of high culture, known to many as the Golden Age. They were free to worship the Daedric princes as they chose, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura. Veloth preached a philosophy of stoicism, pride in their people, and a belief that life was designed to test their faith and the resolve of mortals, to make them stronger. If you'd like to learn more about the full story of the Prophet Veloth, Morrowind, and the Velothi dissident movement that splintered society on the Somerset Isles, then click the link up in the corner of the screen. But today we'll be focusing on one question in particular. What did each of these Daedric princes do? I want to look at what Mephala taught the Chimer first. So tradition holds that she taught them the skills they would need to evade their enemies, or to slay them with secret murder. Enemies were numerous in those times, since the Chimer were but a small faction. He or she, along with Boethia, organised the clan systems that eventually became the basis for the Great Houses. This was always one of my favourite elements of Dunmer or Chimeri culture. Legalised murder. Though I suppose it wouldn't be murder if it's not illegal. Mephala taught them that assassination was a better method of resolving disputes than all-out war. The enemies referred to here would have been the Dunmer, who occupied the same lands at the same time in Morrowind history. Being a small faction, this was also partly a practical measure. They were outgunned and outnumbered from the start, so they preferred to send assassins to take out enemy leaders rather than meet them in the open field. On top of that, Veloth is thought of mainly as a peaceful and scholarly soul, to which the Dunmer's healing enchantments that bear his name attest. Veloth wanted to cause as little bloodshed as possible. He even gave up violence himself, and this element of Chimeri culture bled into the role that the Morag Tong plays later on in their history. The Morag Tong is the legally sanctioned organisation that orchestrates assassinations. Wow, that was a mouthful. The Chimer saw all-out war as barbaric, and they had a sense of honour and respect for one another, those among them at the time, even if they disagreed with them. It was an interesting point that Mephala, along with Boethia, organised the clan systems that eventually became the basis for the Great Houses. The Chimer spread across most of Morrowind, but I don't think that this line actually means that during the Golden Age the Chimer had splintered into these groups yet. The Great Houses of the Dunmer are Dres, Telvanni, Hlaalu, Redoran, and Indoril. They ruled the Dunmer, but they only really came about after the fall of the Velothi culture, centuries later. The improved Emperor's Guide to Tamriel describes what happened. Degenerate Velothi devolved into tribal cultures, which, in time, evolved into the modern Great Houses of Morrowind, or persisted as the barbarian Ashlander tribes. This is repeated in the Pocket Guide to Morrowind, though we must take what the Empire writes about its provinces with a grain of salt. The Velothi people, or the Chimer, abandoned nomadic life and divided themselves into what were known as the Great Houses, tight-knit political clans that survive in Morrowind to this day. So it doesn't seem like Mephala facilitated this divide until much later on, until this culture began to decline, which would have been long after Veloth had died. But the thing that really defined this period of time was the Chimer's unique relationship with the Adada, or in particular, the three good Daedra. It set them apart from the Ultima that they left behind on the Somerset Isles, who had been losing this divine connection for a long time. The Chimer, on the other hand, they had Boethia, who would regularly communicate with them, who would intervene, who would guide the Chimer herself. This is because there was a big focus in Veloth's teachings on the difference between the good and the bad Daedra, how to get the aid of the good Daedra, and how to carefully negotiate with the bad Daedra. But what exactly did they learn from them? We've already talked about some of their values, stoicism, pride, loyalty, and these values are reflected in the mottos of the great houses that eventually took over later on. But I noticed something else interesting about Velothi culture. Architecture. Architecture played a crucial role in their relationship with the Daedra. The Chimer built mighty temples to Boethia, Azura, and Mephala, and established the traditions of worship in Morrowind. But there are more mentions of building and architecture than just that. During the Chimery Golden Age, Veloth's guidance shaped generations of stonemasons and architects, as well as priests and common folk. Why are the stonemasons and architects specifically mentioned? They're clearly separated from the common folk. They seem to be in a class of their own during this time, like priests, who are often revered as authorities and respected. There's also a very curious line in the same book that describes the role Boethia played in their culture. All manner of dark elven cultural advances are attributed to Boethia, from philosophy to magic to responsible architecture. Now, we're never given a definition of what responsible architecture means. I mean, I don't think that they were all incredibly irresponsible engineers before that. No. But there are over a dozen structures called the Velothi Towers in Morrowind, and they're the only real remnants of this age, physical things that you can visit, and they're scattered throughout both Vvardenfell and the mainland. Hanud in the eastern Gracelands, the Tower of Mababi in the Molag Amur region, and Arv's Drelen near Gnissis. The interesting thing is, these towers are some of the best preserved and oldest structures, not just in Morrowind, but in all of Tamriel. Places such as Eladon's Hollow, a massive temple of worship, show no signs of wear, but date back to the early Merethic or even the Dawn era. That's ancient. There's some evidence to suggest that responsible architecture means that the Daedra themselves were directly involved with some of these buildings' construction. There are very few buildings that have remained standing this long, since back to the early Merethic era or even the Dawn era, but the most famous one would probably be the Doreni Tower of Iliac Bay. The tower was built by guess who? The gods, by the Adada. This being the case does suggest to me that Boethia had a direct hand in guiding this responsible architecture of these Velothi buildings. That responsible means architecture that will stand the test of time, but this is really just a pet theory of mine. There isn't actually all that much evidence to necessarily support it, it's all really just speculation, but I love speculating. But there are a couple of other things that Velothi architecture can tell us about this ancient society that I do want to touch on. The Ashlander tribes, which are kind of like the Amish of the Dunmer, they live in the way they think reflects the original teachings of Veloth. They reject the tribunal and the temple. The weird thing is that their tents are specifically modelled after the Velothi towers, the ring, the lead roof, and the awning. That particular design, that architecture seems to be important to them for whatever reason, though we're never necessarily told within the game. And I do want to kind of remind you that architects and stonemasons were set apart in their own profession, their own class, apart from the common folk and alongside the priests. it's clear that they had some significance in this ancient Chimeri society. We also know that Ashlanders practiced ancestor worship, meaning that the Chimer in early Morrowind probably did too, though the practice was dropped after the Dunmer drifted away from the teachings of Veloth. Now, the High Elves do worship their ancestors as well, but it's not quite in the same way. The Altmer are essentially self-pitying wannabe gods who hate the fact that they had to become mortal. They're sort of worshipping what they used to be, what they think that they should be and deserve. The Dunmer don't revere themselves in the same way. Ancestors of the Dunmer, a book holds that here the family members pay their respects to their ancestors through sacrifice and prayer. In return, the family may receive information, training, and blessings. The ancestors are thus the protectors of the home. They learn from their ancestors. They move forward, and it's part of that philosophy of adapting and believing that life is a test. It's about learning and making you stronger. There is another small note that we can make about the architecture of the Velothi Towers. So we know that the Velothi Towers are spread across all of Morrowind. They go right to the northern tip, to the southern tip, to the east, to the west. And their architecture seems to be pretty uniform, pretty similar. But we also know that each of the great houses of Morrowind developed their own style of architecture. House Redoran uses the shells of giant crabs. House Telvanni shapes and grows these massive mushrooms. The fact these styles of architecture only appeared later on when the Chimer had begun to split into their great houses does suggest that the Chimer during this Golden Age were one people. They were united under one rule. Just as their architecture was relatively uniform across all of Morrowind. We've talked about the roles of Mephala and Boethia, and finally we come to Azura, the Prince of Dusk and Dawn. Azura is written in a number of sources to be the ancestor who taught the Chimer how to be different from the Altmer. In the stories, Azura is often encountered as a more communal progenitor of the race as a whole, rather than as an individual ancestor. Her followers describe her as cruel but wise, which is pretty true given that she would later on be the one to curse the Chimer with dark skin and transform them into the Dunmer, the Dark Elves, though that is a whole other story. I'm not sure what to make of this line, of the fact that she was teaching the Chimer to be different from the Altmer. Their differences were largely philosophical and cultural. The Altmer were greedy, while the Chimer lived minimally. The Altmer had an extreme imbalance of power and wealth, while the Chimer seemed actually pretty egalitarian. People talk about how the Chimer, or even the Dunmer now, had a particular concern for the poor and downtrodden. That was Veloth's whole message. I mean, they still had slaves, admittedly, but nobody's perfect. So what was this golden age of the Chimer in Morrowind? It was one of an extremely religious nomadic Chimeri people, who had a uniquely close relationship with the three good Daedra, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura. Each of them taught them different things and helped shape them as a people. They thrived all across Morrowind, fighting their enemies in secrecy with assassins rather than on the open battlefield, and they built great temples and structures under Boethia's guidance that have stood the test of time until this day. At this point, they were relatively peaceful and unified under one rule, but that wouldn't last forever. Eventually they would begin to divide and degenerate as they lost their traditions, connection to the Daedra, their lands, and their old ways. It is written that with the decline of High Velothi culture, with the decline of this golden age, we see the rise of the great houses and the wars with the Dwemer, with the fateful year of 700 of the First Era ever approaching, the Battle of Red Mountain. But that is a story for another day. Hey Subfuries, this video was incredibly fun to write and research because, as I'm sure some of you have seen in the background of my videos, I have a Vvardenfell map as well as Solstheim. That was the first Elder Scrolls game that I ever played, and I loved it, and I still love it to this day. Elder Scrolls is one of my favourite series, and I understand that talking about Velothi architecture may not be the most interesting topic to some people, but it was fascinating to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. My question for you today is, what is your favourite era of history for its architecture? Do you like Greek, or Roman, or feudal Japan? I mean, seriously, like Asiatic countries have some pretty cool architecture from their history.
Also, feel free to leave me any suggestions for Elder Scrolls lore that you'd like me to cover in the future. Elder Scrolls lore is like incredibly deep and complex and weird, and I haven't necessarily felt that it's always been done justice on YouTube, so I'm really trying to kind of give Elder Scrolls lore what I think it deserves, because I don't want to brush over anything when there's so much detail to explore. Like, I can literally talk about one of the emptiest periods of Tamriel history for 13 minutes straight, just speculating. It's really fun and I love it, and I want to do more Elder Scrolls content because I think it would be really cool to kind of have more of this kind of stuff out there. Anyways, I am rambling. I am on 4.5 hours sleep because I was up recording last night, and I'm really trying to make sure that I get this video done. I really hope I upload this Thursday morning, which is like Wednesday afternoon for you guys. I better get back to work. I love you, and thank you for supporting me. I guess that's everything. Stay nerdy, Sub Furies, and I'll see you in the future.